Hello, my name is Peter Parfitt and welcome to the New Brick Workshop. Now today I'm going to talk about one very important subject, and that is writer safety. Now what I don't want to do is, if you've not yet bought your first writer, I don't want to scare you and make you think that it's too dangerous at all for you. That is not the case. With the right knowledge, the writer is one of the most useful tools in woodwork, and I really recommend that every woodworker has at least one. And in this video I'm going to cover both handheld writing, whether it's with a big beast like this one or a more manageable writer like this one. And I'm also going to cover the use of the writer table. At the same time I'm going to show you some little gadgets that you can make up to improve the safety whilst you're using your writer. I put a reasonably large cutter in here. It's one with a rather pleasing shape. And I just want to show you how gentle a decent quality big writer is. Now I'm going to start this writer just holding on with one hand. Now don't do this unless you know your writer really well. It doesn't suddenly jolt into action. It's a fairly gentle thing, and I can run across this piece now and do a cut with this big cutter. Lovely bit of detail. Did it in one pass, so there's no need to be frightened of a big writer. Now let me just encourage you with the use of your writer. If you took a template like this one, you can make not only a hole like this with a hole through it in this piece of wood, but you can make a gadget like this that fits perfectly in it, like so. And it fits in there on that side as well. And that's done with a handheld writer using a very simple template like that. Now in a writer table, you can make a really pleasing shape like this using a cutter like that. And this is exactly what I used when I made a pedestal desk, and this was for those bottom mouldings that go around the bases of the two pedestals. And with handheld writing you can make other pleasing mouldings like this one, again I used on the desk, or even raised panel work. And if you have the right jig, you can even make dovetail joints. But with all of these, you need to know how to use your writer safely. I think one of the most important things to understand is how a writer cutter moves when it's in a writer. Now, if the writer's up here, and this is the cutter that's in it, then viewing it from above, the cutter is going to go clockwise. If it's mounted in a writer table, it's up the other way. In this case, it goes anti-clockwise. So handheld writing and writer table work, you have a different concept of the way the cutter moves. Now I've tried to create a little illustration here. Here I have my writer, and there's a writer cutter. And just like this one, when viewed from above, writer is switched on, it's going to go like so. And in order to make this illustration work, I've put an elastic band around the outside here to give a little bit of friction between this and some of the things I'm going to demonstrate. Now let's suppose we're using the writer on a surface here, and I'm holding my writer like this. Then as I turn it, it's trying to move away from me. That's the friction there making that happen. So a writer in your hand that's trying to move away from you, then you're applying a positive grip to keep it coming towards you, and that's a safe thing to do. What happens if we try it the other way around? So rather than being that way, we're now here and we want it to come towards us. Can you see how the writer wants to come towards me? If I'm pulling, it's going to accelerate towards me, and that is a dangerous situation unless you have full control of the writer. So if you're using a writer in your hand, you need to be this way round, and you need to be pulling the machine towards you. So your cutter is on the left of your stock is held down really well, and you're using it like so. and you hope your elastic band doesn't come off in the process. So here we've got the example where now the writer is in a writer table. So the writer's down here. So rather than the cutter being this way round, it's now that way round, and you can see the direction of spin. So looking down from the top, it is spinning anti-clockwise. Now if I start my pretend writer, like so, if I had a piece of stock here, it would be trying to send it in this direction towards me. So the safe way to use a writer in this circumstance is to be here pushing the stock against the force given by the cutter. That's a safe way. If you're on this side, trying to push the stock this way, you'd find yourself being pulled in towards the cutter. And many accidents have been caused in exactly this fashion, whereby someone is pushing the stock from here and then not able to move their hands out of the way at the last minute, and their fingers get caught in the cutter here. So when using a writer table, try and always set it up so that you're pushing the stock against the force produced by the cutter. Now let's look at that on a real writer table. Now what I've done to try and make this as safe as possible is I've put a piece of 1/4-inch brass dowel in there, so it's completely smooth. So all that piece of brass can impart on any piece of stock I put against it is friction. That will make it just a little bit safer than having a real cutter there. Now I'm using two things to keep my fingers away from it, and I'll describe these in a lot more detail shortly. And I'm going to start by feeding this piece of stock past the cutter like that, and I hope you'll see it relatively. You see it? Yes. Sending it back this way. So as I'm pushing my stock into this, it's trying to push it back towards me, but because I'm pushing from here, I'm in complete control. Now, let me move the fence so that I can demonstrate the other situation where you're trying to feed it the wrong way. So we know with the cutter this way around, we need to be pushing against the direction of the cutter. So if it's stock coming from this way, we'd go that way. And if the stock's on this side of the cutter, then it's this way. So I've just set this up with the stock able to pass at the back. So it would be safe to feed the stock in from the back there, but not from the front. And I'm going to show you what happens when I feed it in from the front here. So this is the wrong way to do it. Please do not try this even with a piece of smooth dowel. And you can probably see that that's only a tiny bit of force because that's a smooth piece of dowel. If that was a real cutter, that would be whipped through there really, really fast. And if you were here with your bare fingers trying to guide this piece of stock and it's being pulled away from you, then there's a really good chance that your fingers are going to end up touching this cutter. So always make sure when you're passing stock past a cutter that you're going against the arrow of the direction of the cutter. Now, push sticks and other little hand protection aids are really important. But before we get on to the push sticks, let's just think about the clothing. You don't want to have any clothing which has little bits that drop down, you know, sort of baggy sleeves. And in general, wearing gloves is not a good idea because if a glove gets caught in something, its material can wrap around a rotating cutter and drag your hand in. And in some circumstances, it may sound odd, it might be better to put your bare hand into a cutter rather than a gloved hand. Because a gloved hand, the glove will drag your whole hand in, whereas if you were to put your hand in without the glove, you would theoretically be able to remove it relatively quickly. So try not to wear gloves unless it's absolutely essential, you know, wood that splinters, whatever it might be. But do be careful. And similarly, don't wear a tie that could dangle down and get mixed up with things. If you've got long hair, tie it back or wear a hat or whatever. Now let's look at the push sticks. This is the traditional design which came for me with one of my tools from Germany a long time ago. And what I like about this design, this sort of bird's beak design or whatever it is called here, is that you can grip and control things in two directions. With this part you can push down, and with this part here you can push in. Just with one push stick you can be pushing something in two directions. And obviously you've still got to push from behind, but this will keep something close in there whilst it's being pushed from behind. So that's very good. Now I've made push sticks like this. Now it might be very difficult to see this. The end of this push stick, I've made it rough. And the way I made it rough is to offer it into the bandsaw lots of times to make lots of little cuts that way. Then I rotated it and made lots of little cuts going down that way. So this end is pretty rough and it's pretty good at gripping things from behind without slipping. So that's that type of push stick. I tend not to use this on a router table. This is the sort of thing I'd use on a table saw or whatever more often. I use this on the table saw, bandsaw, everything, and on the planing machine. You can make a variation of this one, a little bit like this, which is slightly easier to grab. It's got a handle and so on. Now this started off a little bit like this one, but I put it in the pile just to show you it really has been hit quite a few times, either by a rotating saw blade or rotating router cutter. The damage that's being done to this is far better than the damage being done to this. So therefore it's important. Now probably for the router table I find this to be one of the best hand protection aids going. If you imagine, I started off with an old plastic sanding block here, which had lost its sanding abilities, and I used that as the basis, then a piece of wood here and a piece of wood at right angles to it. And in here is a 90-degree groove, and I did that on the router table. So now I've got the ability to guide a piece of stock, and that groove is helping me to keep this down and in, whilst using this at the other end to push along. And for the router table, and actually the saw table as well, I find this to be an absolutely brilliant combination. And I really would recommend you make one of these for yourself if you've got a router table. Now it's really useful to get into the habit of writing with stuff coming towards you. The reason is that when you're working on the edge here, then it is the right way to do a cut on the edge. Now it's also a good way to do a cut in the middle for the first time. And the reason for that is that when you've got the fence here and you're cutting down this way, the movement of the router cutter is trying to not only force the router away from you, but it's also trying to push it in that direction a little bit as well. So in other words, it's helping you to keep the fence tight against this edge. I had a little whoopsie at the very start of this cut because the fence is not continuous. And actually I don't use this particular fence very often. I've got another one, but I can't find it, where I've added a little piece of wood across here, so it's one continuous face, and that helps the start of the cut. What I now want to do is two things. I want to enlarge the cut so it makes it wider this way, and I want to do the same thing this way. Now, let's remember the rules. Now, the cutter is in the router, and it's spinning like so. And if we're moving the router towards us, we want to be cutting on this side of a channel. It's the same if you imagine this is this edge here. If we're cutting along here, we want to be coming towards us on the left-hand edge of the wood, so we'll be going down like that. And cutting on this side of this channel, which already exists, is going to be a similar concept. We're cutting a fresh edge down here, so we're going to be pulling towards us. If we were cutting on this side, we either turn the piece around or we have to push up there. I'm going to start by doing this cut first, and then we'll take it from there. If I want to go this way, I would routinely switch this round. But I've deliberately chosen this piece of wood where I can't guarantee to be able to get the fence running on this side. So we're forced to do the cut that's on this side in the wrong way. So we're going to be cutting on this side, and that means we have to be going in that direction with the router in order to do it safely. It may seem counterintuitive, but we're cutting on this side. If I'd tried to do that last cut this way, the router would have been trying to race towards me and I wouldn't be in control. So that's the way to do it. But it's different if we're using the router table. Now remember, whenever you're going to either put a router cutter in or take one out, always remove the power cable. Don't just rely on switching it off at the wall, always remove the cable. Now the beauty of my little Festool router table, which incidentally is no longer being sold, so I'm not advertising it, is that you do not need a collet extension, because in the router table, the top of the collet comes level with the surface here. And the reason that I find that important is that a long time ago, I had an accident where a router collet extension, which you need for many router tables, it broke, and it broke with a pretty big cutter in it, and it flew around the workshop like a missile. And I was standing here when it happened, and it missed me. And from that moment on, I was determined never to use a collet extension again. Now, when we were using the handheld router, we were making sure that when we came down here, we were cutting from this side of a trench. So in other words, this was the safe side to go down. But when we wanted to cut this side, because we couldn't use this face for my fence, we had to come up here this way, like so. So we then went that way. Everything is reversed with the router table. Now I've moved this round. This is our reference face. If I do this, then you can see that we should be cutting from this outer edge first. And that's the equivalent, if you imagine that outer edge is this edge, it's exactly the same thing. It's the equivalent of cutting like so. So we'll be cutting on this side, just here. That's where we're going to cut. If you imagine it just like doing a cut there, which we would do like so, pushing it away from us. For safety, I've got my push stick and my little gadget here. So there's that cut. We've widened that quite nicely. But if you remember, if we're doing it referencing the same side, but now we want to come off this side, we have to go in the opposite direction. So this time, if I were to put it through this way, it would suddenly race away with me and it would drag the piece of stock like lightning in that direction, and there's a great danger of an accident, either because your fingers are going to be at this end or because this is going to fly somewhere and damage something. So remember, this is the odd case where we're going to go from this direction because we're referencing from the same side here. Now the only risk you run when you're going that way is that the cutter is trying to force the wood away. And you may have just spotted that it did that. And so on this side, we've got a little ding. So when you're doing a cut in this direction, you really have to make sure you're pushing this against the fence because the cutter is trying to push the stock away from the fence. Now I hope this little introduction to router safety, it's been very short, I know, but I hope it's helped. And basically, when you start a router operation, if it's handheld, if you find for any reason that the router is getting away from you in some way, it may be because you're going in the wrong direction. Far better to have the router coming towards you and you're having to force it towards you, rather than having it coming towards you and it's trying to catch up with you. You should always be in control of your router by having to apply positive force to make it move, rather than it wanting to do the movement in the direction you're trying to go. On the router table, you want to be applying force to feed the stock through the router table, and that's the force that you're controlling. If you set things up in such a position that the cutter is making the stock move in the direction that you're trying to make it go, then it's likely to be the wrong type of cut. Now, there is something separate from all of this called a climbing cut. I'm not going to cover it here, but I'll just briefly describe. A climbing cut is where you go against all these rules, and you would do this just to produce a final bit of finish on a piece of work where you must be in full control. That's called a climbing cut, but I'm not going to go into the detail now. That's something for a later date. Many thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.